located in the pericardial cavity, within the mediastinum, within the thorax, within the ventral body cavity. So if you kind of go from small to large, sitting in the pericardial cavity, then within the mediastinum, then within the thorax, then within the ventral body cavity. It lies between the second rib and the fifth intercostal space, and 2/3 of the heart lies to the left of the mid-sternal line. So if you've ever seen anybody doing the Pledge of Allegiance, they put their hand over their heart, they go this direction, heart lies 2/3 to the left. And it rests on the superior surface of the diaphragm. When we look at the heart, we're gonna have a base associated with it, and we have an apex associated with it. The base is the broad portion, and exiting from the base of the heart, we're gonna see the great vessels, pulmonary trunk and the aorta. So these are the great outflow vessels, and this base is going to face the right shoulder. The apex, which is the point associated with the heart, points towards the left hip and is composed primarily of the left ventricle. So this is going to be looking at a transverse section of the thoracic cavity, and so when we look at the thoracic cavity, it's divided into the two pleural cavities found laterally, and then we have the mediastinum, which is going to be outlined by this dotted line. You can see there's a lot of different things located in that mediastinum, but included in that mediastinum is going to be the pericardial cavity, which is going to house the heart. This is an anterior view now looking at the heart, lying 2/3 to the left. This is going to be the base of the heart here, which is pointing up towards the right shoulder. This is where those great outflow vessels are located. And then this is the apex of the heart pointing down towards the left hip. It's primarily left ventricle. This is a chest x-ray, and when we look at it, we can see this domed structure here. What do you think this is here? This is diaphragm. Why is it a little bit higher on this side? What's located right underneath here? Liver. So liver is located on the right side and keeps the dome of the diaphragm a little bit higher on that right side. We're going to have the two lungs in the pleural cavities, and then in the mediastinum within the pericardial cavity, we're going to see the heart. And you can see that it lies 2/3 to the left side. You can see that the base of the heart is pointing towards the right shoulder, so you know those great vessels are coming out here. And then this would be the apex of the heart, so you know this is going to be left ventricle at this location. If you've ever watched Scrubs, at the very beginning they threw up an x-ray, and in some of the episodes they actually put it up backwards. I don't know if they know they put it up backwards, or whether they did it as an inside joke for anybody, and it's in the medical field. So this should sound somewhat familiar. When we look at the heart wall, we see that the heart wall has a number of layers associated with it, and we also see that there is a sac around the heart. And when we look at that sac around the heart, it's known as the pericardium, and that pericardium is going to be this sac that's going to surround the heart, the beginning of the great vessels. The pericardium has two layers associated with it. It has the fibrous pericardium, this thick, dense connective tissue, and then underlying that on the inside of that fibrous pericardium is the parietal layer of the serous pericardium. So we know that if there's a parietal layer, that means there's a visceral layer, and so you can see how that is going to reflect back. And then you have the visceral layer of the serous pericardium, which is actually the first layer of the heart wall, bless you, which is the epicardium. So if we actually look at the heart wall, so this is this section through the heart wall here, this is the blood located in one of the chambers. The first layer is going to be the visceral layer of the serous pericardium, also known as the epicardium. We then have the myocardium, which is the thickest layer, composed primarily of cardiac muscle. There's also a little bit of connective tissue in there for the cells to connect to. And then lining the inside of the heart is going to be the endocardium. And that endocardium has a number of different cell types associated with it, but we also have what's called the intrinsic conduction system located in that endocardium. Any questions on that? Should be a review. So when we look at the heart, we can see there's 4 chambers associated with the heart. There's 2 atria and 2 ventricles. The atria are located more superiorly, and they are the receiving chambers. In this view here, we see a little bit of the atria here as the auricles, these little ear-like extra little spaces or pouches that kind of wrap around towards the front. They are part of the atria. The atria are the receiving chambers, so the blood coming back to the heart is going to be received by the atria. There's one on the right, one on the left. And the ventricles then are found more inferiorly. And the ventricles, there's one on the right, one on the left, are the discharging chambers. So they're the ones that are going to create a lot of pressure, push the blood through the different pathways or different circulation pathways. So here we have cartoon representation of an anterior view followed then by a posterior view on the next slide. Both cartoon representation and actual dissection. So we're going to see that in this view here, we can see the right atrium and a little bit of the left atrium. So this is going to be that ear-like process of the right atrium and the rest of the right atrium back in this area here. The very beginning of the left atrium is here as the little bit of the tip of the auricle. And then we have below that the right ventricle and the left ventricle. You can see the outflow tracts here. This is the pulmonary trunk, and this is the ascending aorta coming out of the center. Posterior view. From the posterior view, you get a much better look at the different atria. We're going to see that this is the right atrium, left ventricle, right ventricle. So in the actual dissection, this is going to be your left atrium, this is going to be your right atrium, and then we're going to have the left ventricle and the right ventricle. Questions? So let's take a closer look at those chambers. We're going to see first we have the two atria, and we've seen the atria from the external surface, but now we want to look at the inside of them. And when we go inside and look at the atria, we see that the internal surface is going to have a smooth walled part and a ridge walled part. And this difference has to do with embryonic development and what these two parts came from two different embryonic structures. The ridge walled part, when you look at the ridges, those ridges are actually just cardiac muscle that's grouped together and created ridges along the wall, and you call those ridges pectinate muscles. So if you see the ridges along the wall when you're in the atria, you're going to call them pectinate muscles. Both atria also have auricles associated with them. These are these ear-shaped muscular pouches. When you think about the atria, also remember that the atria are going to be receiving blood coming back from the different circulation systems. And we'll talk about which ones in a second. But if you open up, and here we open up the right atrium, you can see there's a smooth walled part here, and then ridge walled part. And so these little ridges here are the pectinate muscles. And it's just the cardiac muscle that's kind of grouped together along the walls. So the question is, where is the blood coming from, and is that blood oxygenated or deoxygenated? So we're going to see that the right atrium is going to receive blood from the superior vena cava, inferior vena cava, and the coronary sinus. These three structures are bringing deoxygenated blood back to the heart. So it's deoxygenated blood that's coming back into the right atrium. The superior vena cava, basically, you can kind of think of it as the superior vena cava is bringing blood back to the heart from areas above the diaphragm or superior to the diaphragm. The inferior vena cava is going to bring blood back to the heart from areas inferior to the diaphragm. And the coronary sinus is going to bring blood back from the heart wall. Even though there's all that blood associated with the heart itself within the different chambers, think about the thickness of the heart wall. Obviously, we can't have that much diffusion take place. And also think about the fact that the right side of the heart has deoxygenated blood associated with it, and so that's not very useful. So it has to have its own coronary circulation. And the last of the veins of the coronary circulation is the coronary sinus, which dumps into the right atrium. Now the left atrium, on the other hand, is going to receive oxygenated blood coming back from the lungs. There are 4 pulmonary veins typically that are going to come in. They're named very nicely. You have 2 on the right, 2 on the left, 2 that are superior, and 2 that are inferior. So you end up with the right superior pulmonary vein, right inferior pulmonary vein, left superior pulmonary vein, and left inferior pulmonary vein. So if we look at this posterior view, we can see the left atrium here, and we can see the 4 pulmonary veins that I just discussed in those positions there. 2 are in a superior location, 2 are in an inferior location, 2 are on the right, and 2 are on the left. So it gives you the orientation to be able to name them. Then coming into the right atrium, we're going to have the superior vena cava and the inferior vena cava. And then also, if you see this large vein right underneath the left atrium, it's crossing underneath the left atrium, this is the coronary sinus, and that's bringing the deoxygenated blood from the heart wall over to the right atrium. So remember, although the coronary sinus is seen just inferior to the left atrium, it's actually heading towards the right side to dump over there. Now, here's another view looking into the right atrium, and if we look into that right atrium, we see this little divot, this little fossa, and it's oval shaped, so it's another fossa ovalis. And so it's going to be about the size of your thumbprint. The fossa ovalis that we see in the adult heart, or even a child's heart, is the remnant of a foramen ovale, an actual hole that was there during embryonic development. During embryonic development, the foramen ovale is going to shunt blood from the right atrium over to the left atrium. And that's because of where the blood is coming from that's oxygenated. During embryonic development, the fetus is going to be getting oxygen from mom through the placenta, and that oxygenated blood is going to come back through a number of veins, which we'll take a look at in a minute, and end up getting dumped into, because of the way it's set up, into the right atrium. Well, that doesn't make sense. We need that oxygenated blood on the other side. We need to be able to send it out to the body parts, plus the lungs are non-functional at this point. So we're kind of, this shunt area, this foramen ovale, is a shunt to be able to bypass that pulmonary circulation that we see associated with the right side of the heart. So think of it as a shunt.
So like usually the way that like the heart's blood flow is explained to us, it's kind of explained to us like right atrium, right ventricle, left atrium, left ventricle, right? Like it's kind of flowing into each other, but like isn't it working at the same time?
They're working at the same time, so they're closed off from each other. And so really the way to think of it is that the blood is going to be coming back from the superior vena cava, the inferior vena cava, or the coronary sinus into the right atrium. From the right, and let's see if I can, there we go. So think of it more this way. So here is your right atrium here. So the superior vena cava, inferior vena cava, and coronary sinus are going to be dumping into that. Then the blood is going to go into the right ventricle and out the right ventricle and through the pulmonary circuit. And so you're going to go through the pulmonary trunk into the pulmonary arteries, over to the lungs, do the exchange, and then you're going to come back to the left side of the heart. From the left side of the heart, you go into the left atrium through one of those 4 pulmonary veins, into the left ventricle, and from the left ventricle out the aorta, and then we're going to be able to go through the systemic circuit where we can drop off oxygen and nutrients and things. Then we're going to end up coming back to the right side of the heart. Now, those chambers are working at the same time, and they're actually pushing out the same amount of blood. So every time you listen to the heart and hear the lub-dub, what's happening is the atria are going to contract, then the ventricles contract, and then the ventricle is going to push that blood out and through the different circuits, but independently of one another.
So then like how is that possible for us to be pushing out the same amount if one is doing something, like one is sending to lung, and one is sending to body, so like how does this
So the
5 liters circulate at the same time?
So it's all a closed system, and so the same amount of blood is going to be arriving back at the heart, but at the same time, you still have blood going out through the circuits. So there's constantly blood in all the different components associated with the heart and the different circuits. It's just this certain amount of blood always arrives back at the atria, into the ventricles, and then out through the outflow tracts. So you can kind of think of it.
So the rate like is 2.5 liters that comes out the left ventricle and 2.5 that comes into the right atrium. You think
I
it's like
think
that?
I'm trying to think what the actual milliliters are. milliliters with every push. Gets pushed out. I mean, obviously you have like about 6 or 7 liters of blood in the whole system, but it's only a certain amount of milliliters that are pushed out with every push. Yeah. Does that answer that question? See if some of the other information we're gonna go through helps with that. So during embryonic development, what you need to remember is that we want to bypass, since what we just went over, talked about the fact that the right side of the heart is going to be the pump for, because remember it's a double pump system, and that double pump, when you think about it, the right side of the heart is the pump for the pulmonary circuit. The left side of the heart is the pump for the systemic circuit. Well, during embryonic development, we're not utilizing the lungs for our for the oxygen exchange, and so we're getting oxygen from mom. It's coming back into the right atrium, and so we want to shunt that oxygenated blood over to the left side of the heart, and so that foramen ovale allows us to do that. And there's a little valve associated with it. As soon as the baby takes the first breath, it changes up the pressure in the system, and that valve is going to slam shut and then try to separate the two systems. But it takes about a year or two for the valve to completely close. And so what can happen is that if you've ever seen a baby and they kind of like hold their breath and they start to turn a little bit purple, they're changing up the pressure in their system, and they can actually pop that valve back open and shunt a little bit of deoxygenated blood over to the left side and start to push that around the system. And so they turn a little purple, but as soon as they take a breath, it balances back out. Now, sometimes this doesn't close properly. In 20% of individuals, there's something called a probe patent foramen ovale. It's about 1 in 5 people, so there's a couple people in this room who probably have this, and it's not clinically important. There doesn't seem to be any clinical association with it. They call it a probe patent because people don't realize they have this issue until a medical student or your dental student goes in and does the dissection, and they open up the right atrium and they can put a probe between the right side of the heart and the left side of the heart. So it's called a probe patent foramen ovale. But there's also, this wall here is called the atrial septum. There's also atrial septal defects that are clinically important where there is constant shunting of blood, and those do need to be fixed. So if that valve doesn't close and there still is shunting of blood between the two sides on a regular basis, that does need to be repaired. Let's go down to the ventricles. So the ventricles are the discharging chambers, so they're the ones that are going to create all the pressure to be able to push the blood from the ventricles through the whole system. So what we'll see is that the right side of the heart, the right ventricle, is the pump for what's creating the pressure to push the blood through the whole entire pulmonary circuit, while the left ventricle is going to be that which is creating the pressure to push the blood all the way through the systemic circuit. When we look inside at the ventricles, we can see that there are 2 bundles of cardiac muscle. If it's up against the wall, it's called trabeculae carne. So when we looked at the atria, we saw bundles of cardiac muscle up against the wall. It's called pectinate muscles. If we're in the ventricles, we're just going to call them the trabeculae carne. But there's also cardiac muscle that bundles into something that does not jet along the side of the wall, but instead is going to come into the middle of the ventricle, and these are called papillary muscles. So papillary muscles are interesting in the fact that they're sort of cone-shaped, and at their apex, there's these little cords called chordae tendineae, and they attach to the atrioseptal, attach to the atrioventricular cusps. So those cusps associated with the AV valves. When the ventricles contract, the papillary muscles also contract, and it's not to actually close the AV valves. So these papillary muscles are not closing the AV valves, but instead what they're doing is taking up any slack in the chordae tendineae and making sure those atrioventricular valve flaps don't prolapse. They don't pop back open, because there's going to be huge pressure inside those ventricles.